beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. All things came to be through him, and without him nothing came to be. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And God said to the darkness, "Let there be light." And God said, "Let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters, and let it separate waters from the waters." And God called the firmament heaven. And God said, "Let the dry land appear. Let the earth put forth vegetation, plants, and fruit trees, yielding seed, each according to its kind upon the earth. Let the waters bring forth swarms of living creatures in the seas, and all kinds of birds to fly above the earth, across the firmament of the heavens. Let the earth bring forth living creatures, cattle and creeping things and beasts of the earth, all according to their kinds. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image and likeness." So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. God blessed them and said, "Be fruitful and multiply. Fill the earth and subdue it. Have dominion over all the earth, everything that has the breath of life." What has happened to our world? Why are so many people suffering and confused? Why is there so much death? Why have we abandoned so much of our history and our tradition? This hasn't happened overnight. It's taken centuries to tear down Christian civilization and God's laws, which have been followed since the beginning of time. But what is the greatest attack we face today? What is it, and where is it coming from? For 2 centuries, the ideologues of socialism or communism have used deceptive word jugglery to rebrand themselves as liberals or progressives, becoming wolves in sheep's clothing. Wolves who have infiltrated our institutions with the Gnostic cultural Marxist movement that has reordered our traditional biblical understanding of nature, marriage, and family. Paul Kengor is a professor of political science at Grove City College, executive director of the Center for Vision and Values, and visiting fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. He is an acclaimed New York Times best-selling author of over a dozen books. His book, Takedown, is a shocking chronology of how the far left has sought to destroy traditional sex differences, marriage, and family, culminating in its embrace of same-sex marriage.
So really, in the end, what is the agenda? What's the goal here? And the agenda is basically that ye shall be as gods. So they in the role of God, small g gods, because when you can come up with your own definitions of things that heretofore had been the total province of the laws of nature and nature's God, and you render unto yourself the ability to redefine something that heretofore God had defined that, and you say that you can now do that, well, here again, back to the Garden of Eden, this is the first mistake. Ye shall be as gods. So you are making yourself your own God. And I cannot do that. I'm going to have enough to answer for. That's one that I don't want to have to answer for. The most fascinating and frustrating thing about cultural Marxism is that people don't even know what it is. And a lot of people that are pursuing those ends have no idea of it. So if you go up to somebody and say, you know, this is really a kind of a Marcusean, Antonio Gramsci, Wilhelm Reich, sexual revolution, Frankfurt School, kind of cultural Marxist thing you're doing here, they'll look at you like you're out of your mind. Cultural Marxism today is more often referred to as critical theory. And there are many colleges in America that have critical theory programs and departments. In fact, our president of fundamental transformation, Barack Obama, went to Occidental College, which has a department of critical theory and social justice. Queer theory, phrase that they use, all of this which falls under the umbrella of critical theory. In a way, I like the phrase critical theory better than cultural Marxism, because really what they're doing is criticizing everything. And everything that at least heretofore existed as what we understood in the Judeo-Christian West as a moral absolute. And what they really mean by critical in terms of critical theory is destroying. So not even just criticizing it, but redefining it, taking it down, destroying it, deconstructing it, taking it apart. They took classical Marxism, which under Marx and Engels was an economic model. The cultural Marxists took all of this and looked at it not through the prism of economics and class, but through culture and sex in particular. They established, of all things, a form of Freudian Marxism. Culture would be the goal. Culture, culture, culture. Sex, sex, sex. Education, education, education. For them, their world could be the university classroom. That's where the cultural revolution could and would take place.
This film tells the story of a number of new wolves in sheep's clothing, ravenous men and women who seek to destroy our faith and future. False prophets with a clear and present gender agenda to destroy our families and corrupt our children by redefining the very nature and sacred dignity of being a man and woman made in God's image and likeness. Let us begin. By their fruits you will know them. Simone de Beauvoir was born in 1908 into a Paris, France middle-class home. Her father, Georges, was a staunch atheist. Her mother, Françoise, a devout Catholic. Simone, as a child, was openly religious. For a time, she even considered becoming a nun. As she grew older, she grew closer and closer to her father. Though ironically, she claimed her father never once embraced her. Simone thinks like a man, her father constantly boasted, and which she enjoyed him saying. At his death, he refused to see a priest. At age 14, she decided that she didn't believe in God.
One night, I summoned God, if he really existed, to show himself to me. He didn't, and I never addressed another word to him. I loved the world, and it was suddenly God whose price was small. Literature took the place in my life occupied by religion, and it absorbed me entirely and transfigured my life. One afternoon in Paris, I realized that I was condemned to death. I was alone in the house, and I did not attempt to control my despair. I screamed and tore at the red carpet.
As a young girl, Simone came to view her parents' marriage as disunity, and that her mother was imprisoned by homemaking, while her father was free. Thus she called father the transcendent one, and her mother the immanent one. She came to see self and other, marriage and love, matter and spirit, holiness and intelligence, nature and culture, man and woman, all to be complete radical contradictions.
By limiting women to tiresome, empty, monotonous household tasks, marriage mutilates and annihilates the wife. In marriage, her life is virtually finished forever. Society, being codified by man, decrees that woman is inferior. She can do away with this inferiority only by destroying male's superiority.
De Beauvoir embraced Karl Marx's evil dualistic conflict theory of oppressor and oppressed that would polarize our society and shape our culture of death.
In the Communist Manifesto, you see statements like this: abolition of the family, exclamation mark. Even the most radical flare up at this infamous proposal of the communists. Wow, 1848, abolition of the family was already an infamous proposal of the communists? I mean, this is the programmatic statement, the manifesto of the Communist Party. And already then, even before the manifesto was out, this was known as an infamous proposal of the communists. And they say, one paragraph after that, the bourgeois family will vanish as a matter of course when its complement vanishes, and both will vanish with the vanishing of capital. And then get this: do you charge us with wanting to stop the exploitation of children by their parents? To this crime, we plead guilty.
Simone's rejection of religion led her to study and teach philosophy and to write her first novels. De Beauvoir chose as the epitaph of her first novel the words of Karl Marx's master, Friedrich Hegel. Each consciousness pursues the death of the other. Since the other, for de Beauvoir, would be motherhood in Western civilization. Birth control and abortion would become for her the sacraments of her lifestyle. Simone met Jean-Paul Sartre in 1929 at the Sorbonne in Paris, and soon after moved in with him. His relationship became the greatest influence on her life and work. Sartre was a philosopher, playwright, novelist, and political activist. His novel, Nausea, is in some ways the modern manifesto of atheistic existentialism, one without a God and no human nature, except the one which she alone would design. Sartre is called the philosopher of the 20th century, fitting for the death of God century that would shape the greatest genocidal holocaust in the history of the world.
Existentialism is nothing else than an attempt to draw all the consequences of a coherent atheistic position. Man is nothing else than what he makes of himself. To choose to be this or that is to affirm at the same time the value of what we choose, because we can never choose evil. Without God, all things are permissible.
Key to de Beauvoir's life and influence was that she would agree with what Sartre's book, Being and Nothingness, demonstrated. That
Essence does not precede existence. In pure subjectivity, the human being is not anything. He is measured by his acts.
Dr. Paul Vitz is Professor Emeritus of Psychology at New York University and Senior Scholar and Professor of the Institute for Psychological Sciences at Divine Mercy University in Arlington, Virginia. His work focuses primarily on the relationship between modern psychology and Christianity. The author of many books, his work, Sigmund Freud's Christian Unconscious, offers the historical and biographical evidence for Freud's deep, lifelong rejection of Catholicism. His latest book, Faith of the Fatherless, The Psychology of Atheism, focuses on the importance of fatherhood. His current research is centered on the complementarity of the sexes.
Sartre said that essence did not precede existence. And what he wanted to get rid of was that there were essential qualities that were essentially bound up in the nature of a thing's existence. And so he said that existence comes before or precedes essence. And therefore, your existence comes before who you are or what your essence is.
Sartre was an apologist for tyranny and terror. He was a supporter of Stalin, Mao, and Castro. Sartre's ideas inspired the Khmer Rouge leadership and the events in Cambodia in the 1970s, in which between 1/5 and 1/3 of the nation was starved to death or murdered. This was the work of a group of intellectuals who were, for the most part, pupils and admirers of Jean-Paul Sartre. Sartre called for violence and death in his preface to Frantz Fanon's book, The Wretched of the Earth, endorsing his devotees' neo-colonial Marxism that would later devastate Africa. Robert Riley is a writer and senior fellow at the American Policy Council in Washington and director of the Westminster Institute in McLean, Virginia. Under the Reagan administration, he served as senior advisor for public diplomacy at the U.S. Embassy in Switzerland, and later in the Office of the Secretary of Defense. He is the author of many books, including Making Gay Okay: How Rationalizing Homosexual Behavior is Changing Everything.
Simone de Beauvoir's paramour, Jean-Paul Sartre, gave the philosophical principle behind this that eventually devolved into the transgender self-mutilation. And that is that existence precedes essence. Now, one would have to have studied a little metaphysics to understand the consequences of such a statement. Existence precedes essence means that you somehow exist without a nature. You're not anything, really, which leaves you in a very precarious situation, and thus the angst of existentialism. So how do you become something if you have existence but no essence? Well, you have to obtain an essence through your own will. So what becomes paramount is will rather than reason. Reason was there to apprehend the nature of reality, but if existence precedes essence, there is no nature of reality, and will becomes paramount. And this, of course, is the key of the 20th century ideologies, totalitarian ideologies, which for Hitler was triumph of the will on a race-based theory of man, or the communist class-based theory of man, both of them based on the primacy of will as against reason. So what we're seeing today in the transgender and the whole LGBT agenda is downstream from Sartre and de Beauvoir, just living out the full implications of what it means if you exist before you have an essence.
De Beauvoir lived with Sartre. Breaking with moral traditions, they never married, seeking a freedom outside monogamy. Their so-called open relationship gave them license to form all kinds of sexual relationships with others, both men and women.
I blamed us. Myself as much as you, actually. In the past, in the future, in the absolute, the way we treat people. I felt it was unacceptable.
In his diaries, Sartre wrote that he enjoyed being a scholarly Don Juan, slaying women through the power of my golden tongue. Nothing struck me as more moving than the moment at which the avowal of love is finally wrenched forth. After that would happen, he rarely knew what to do with his conquests.
In itself, homosexuality is as limiting as heterosexuality. The idea should be to be capable of loving a woman or a man, either, a human being, without feeling fear, restraint, or obligation. I am too intelligent, too demanding, too resourceful for anyone to take charge of me entirely. No one knows me or loves me completely. I have only myself.
Simone never had children. She kept a kind of bond with Sartre as long as he lived. The philosopher Merleau-Ponty turned on its head the classical view of the human person, with a hierarchy, a primacy to God over soul and its faculties of memory, intellect, and will over the body. Merleau-Ponty eliminated God and gave primacy to the body and feelings, to what he termed embodiment and the flesh of the world, giving elite academic credence to the dumbing down of culture.
The body is our anchorage in the world. I am not in front of my body, I am in it, or rather, I am it. If we can still speak of interpretation in relation to the perception of one's own body, we shall have to say that it interprets itself. We know not through our intellect, but through our experience.
The outbreak of World War II in 1939 and the German occupation of France in 1940 also contributed to her philosophical perspective.
Robots over France are direct targets for our gunners. New weapons of war add to the increasing thrills recorded by intrepid cameramen.
From 1943 to 1944, during the Nazi occupation of France, de Beauvoir, without coercion and with other options, chose freely to work for Radio Vichy, the communications pawn in France for the National Socialist Party. Dr. Ingrid Galster, an expert on Simone de Beauvoir, termed her job as a sound director in the Nazi propaganda machine to be at the very least subtle collaboration. The Telegraph also reported that the reason she couldn't keep her teaching job was her procuring for Jean-Paul Sartre's pedophilia addiction. In 1943, Simone de Beauvoir was fired for her behavior leading to the corruption of a minor.
Absurdity challenges every ethics. But also, the finished rationalization of the real would leave no room for ethics. It is because man's condition is ambiguous that he seeks through failure and outrageousness to save his existence. I feel something inside of me which scares me, an exhausting violence. But I accept the great adventure of being me.
After the war, through Les Temps Modernes, the monthly journal founded by she and Sartre in 1945, they attempted to create a cultural Marxist socialism, one less dependent on the brutal, bloody forms of World War II.
Equality between men and women will be possible when the socialist society is realized worldwide. When there would no longer be men and women, but only workers, equal with one another. Formerly, I thought that the class struggle had to happen before the struggle between the sexes. Now, I find it necessary to lead them both together. The fact is that men encounter more complicity in their women companions than the oppressor usually finds in the oppressed. And in bad faith, they use it as a pretext to declare that a woman wanted the destiny that a man imposed on her.
De Beauvoir's The Second Sex was published in 1949. It called for the moral revolution of existentialism, which reverses the principle that essence precedes existence.
One is not born, but rather becomes a woman. No biological, psychological, or economic fate determines the figure that the human female presents in society. It is civilization as a whole that produces this creature, intermediate between male and unique, which is described as feminine.
In her book, she explains how women's liberation is intimately related to the fate of socialism.
As socialism, true socialism, establishes economic equality among all peoples, the feminist movement learned it had to establish equality between the sexes by taking power away from the ruling class within the movement, that is, from men. Put another way, once inside the class struggle, women understood the class struggle does not eliminate the sex struggle.
While she was writing Second Sex, de Beauvoir was editing the Marxist journal Modern Times. Throughout her life, she and Sartre exhibited their support for communism, especially for the Frankfurt School's critical theory, its sexual revolution, and multiculturalism. They traveled together to visit Stalinist Russia, Maoist China, and Castro's Cuba. The Second Sex initiated the anti-creation movement to undermine the dignity of life, nature, and human nature. Life becomes dominated by the will to power. Thus, we see the emergence of what the popes have called the dictatorship of relativism and ideological colonization. Ryan T. Anderson is the William E. Simon Senior Research Fellow at the Heritage Foundation in Washington, D.C. Ryan's latest book, When Harry Becomes Sally, Responding to the Transgender Moment, attempts to give what the National Review calls a measured perspective of the current gender crisis.
You know, I quote one activist in the book saying that biological sex is a social construct. The way that this originally came up was that they said gender is a social construct and that sex is merely a biological fact. So originally they were gonna say, look, sex, whether you're XX or XY, whether you have male genitalia or female genitalia, that's merely biology, but that's different than gender, which is a social construct. Now they're saying everything is a social construct, even biological sex. And so they're saying that gender identity determines someone's sex. Sex is merely assigned at birth, but it could be misassigned. So later in life, you can have sex reassignment, surgery, hormones, and all of the rest. It's a vision of reality that says there are no truths baked into reality. There are no truths about human nature. There's no truths about nature writ large. That's very different than the American founding, right, which said that there are certain laws of nature and nature's God, that saw faith and reason going together, that saw philosophy and theology, science and the Bible forming a coherent whole, revealing truths to us, not merely will to power from a certain Nietzschean perspective, not merely social construction, that there are actually truths embedded in reality that we could discover and that we could then live in accordance with. That's a very different vision than saying we just construct reality according to our own desires.
In 1977, de Beauvoir, accompanied by a large contingent of Marxist French intelligentsia, signed a petition which demanded the legalization of pedophilia. It required the immediate release of 3 individuals due to serve long jail sentences for sexually abusing boys and girls aged 11 to 14. De Beauvoir and Sartre signed the petition. Published in the newspaper Le Monde, their petition said this of pedophilia: a simple vice affair where the children have not been victims of the slightest violence, who consented, although the law at present denies them their right to consent, who today risk to be sentenced to a long prison term, either for having had sexual relations with minors, boys as well as girls, or for having encouraged and taken photographs of their sexual plays. The designation as a crime, which serves to legitimatize such a severity, and the facts themselves. Even more so, the antiquated law and the reality of everyday life in a society which claims to know about the sexuality of children and adolescents.
The great Simone. She was really something. She and Jean-Paul Sartre in this little world, this little coven they created on the left bank in Paris.
Mallory Millett is a former left-wing radical and Hollywood actress. Today, she is a practicing Catholic and a director of the David Horowitz Freedom Center.
We'll see you there.
She is the sister of Kate Millett, the American feminist and co-founder of NOW, the National Organization for Women. Mallory's sister Kate has been described by the New York Times as a seminal influence on second-wave feminism. She is best known for her book, Sexual Politics, published in 1970.
It was her Columbia University PhD thesis. And I was living with her and her Japanese husband in their loft on the Bowery. And we'd get up and have breakfast every morning, and she'd be working on her book, and she'd read me passages from her book, and we were all very excited about this. In fact, I titled the book. I was the one who came up with the title Sexual Politics. And it was immediately an instant hit. They put her on the cover of Time magazine. They called her the Mao Zedong of the women's movement. And of course, when my sister became famous, she got to know Simone de Beauvoir. She made a point of that because she worshiped Simone de Beauvoir. I mean, they became very, very good friends. And my sister would fly over to France all the time. Kate Millett and her Simone de Beauvoir and all of her pals, you know, they would sit in their salons in Paris and have their little pipe dreams, their little utopian fantasies.
In my opinion, so long as the family and the myth of the family and the myth of maternity and the maternal instinct are not destroyed, women will still be oppressed. No, we don't believe that any woman should have that choice. No woman should be authorized to stay at home to raise her children. Society should be totally different. No woman should be allowed this choice precisely because if there is such a choice, too many women will make it one.
Dr. Alice von Hildebrand is a renowned lecturer, author, television host, and retired professor of Hunter College. Her late husband, Dietrich von Hildebrand, is one of the most celebrated philosopher-theologians of our modern age. Her published works include The Soul of a Lion, a biography of her husband, and The Privilege of Being a Woman, the reflections of a true feminist.
The wolf is hidden in clothing, the liberation of women. And this liberation is nothing but slavery, because they give up their gift, this extraordinary gift of the collaboration between God and life, which is precisely what a maternity is. The attack on femininity, the vicious attack on the beauty of motherhood. Let us go back to Genesis, when God created a man and a woman, which are superbly complementary. They're different, but their difference is enriching for one another, because it wasn't good for man to be alone. Man is made for communion, and communion means love, and love means self-giving. It is said Adam sees Eve, and he's enchanted, blood of my blood and flesh of my flesh, bone of my bone. And then he gives her a superb title, a title that should make every single little girl conscious of the fact that she's a little girl. Thank God. She's called the Mother of the Living, establishing a bond between woman and life, which is dictated by God himself. The serpent turned to Eve because was she the weaker one, and therefore easier to conquer and to defeat. Being infinitely clever, and much more clever than we are, he knew perfectly well that Eve had an immense influence on Adam. And as soon as she was conquered, he would follow suit, which is exactly what happened. Because she gives him the apple, he doesn't say, my dear wife, what do you mean we're not permitted to eat it? He eats it. And then afterwards, a real coward, when God made reproaches to him, he said, the wife that you gave him. Therefore, the devil attacks Eve because she's a mother of the living. And he was a murderer from the beginning. No, therefore, there is a war between Eve and the devil, between life and death. And we have got to realize that what is happening today is a war on the beauty and greatness and femininity.
In 1983, the Catholic Church placed Simone de Beauvoir's Second Sex on the index of prohibited books. The announcement was made in Osservatore Romano in an article entitled Immoral Existentialism. 3 years later, Simone died of pneumonia in Paris at age 78. She was buried next to Sartre at the Montparnasse Cemetery in Paris.
She claims that she was not born a woman. She claims she became a woman. Well, what that means is that when she was born, she had existence, but no essence. And the essence that she ended up having, she was given by the culture. And it's not a real essence, therefore. It was something given to her. She hadn't freely chosen it. And therefore, she could now freely choose whatever her essence might be. And so therefore, she was going to choose to be more like, if you'll pardon the interpretation, she would choose to be more like the first sex.
Alfred Charles Kinsey was born the oldest of 3 children, June 23, 1894, in Hoboken, New Jersey. His parents, Alfred Sr. and Sarah, were strict Methodists and of modest means. Alfred Jr. was a sickly child. After high school, he was forced by his father to study engineering at his old college, the Stevens Institute of Technology. But Kinsey chose to continue his education in applied biology at Harvard. There he chose Professor William Morton Wheeler to be his mentor. Kinsey would soon imitate his mentor by becoming an agnostic and a Darwinian evolutionist. In 1919, Kinsey graduated and went to teach at Indiana University. At a picnic, he met Clara Bracken McMiller, a chemistry student. They married in 1924 and had 4 children. Kinsey was bisexual. He himself had sex with other men. He and his wife agreed that each could have sex with other people as well as with each other. Dr. Judith Reisman is an eminent professor, author, and the leading expert on Alfred Kinsey. She has served as associate professor at the University of Haifa in Israel and full professor at American University in Washington, D.C. She is currently director of the Institute for Media Education and director of the Child Protection Center at Liberty University School of Law. Dr. Reisman's unique research caused a re-examination of the very basis of Kinsey's work. It demonstrated his direct influence on America's sexual revolution. Some of Dr. Reisman's notable books include Kinsey, Crime and Consequences, and Kinsey, Sex and Fraud, The Indoctrination of a People. Dr. Reisman's studies show how Kinsey and his work sought to normalize in society his own personal deviant sexual habits.
When they married, immediately, he was involved in the sex research right away. And what a guy like that is called now, who marries, she was his beard, is what the homosexual movement refers to marrying somebody in order to maintain your position in society. And it would have been an absolute ruin for him if he would have been known to be homosexual.
By 1929, Kinsey had studied eugenics at the Bussey Institution. This led him to develop a deep relationship with Dr. Herman Joseph Muller, a radical socialist and a colleague at Indiana University. Muller would receive a Rockefeller Foundation grant in 1932. It was for further study of eugenics at the Kaiser Wilhelm Brain Research Center in Berlin. In 1938, Kinsey suddenly chose to leave entomology and to teach a radically liberal course on marriage, family, and sexuality, dressed all the while in conservative suits and bow ties.
So he was teaching this course, and that gave him the excuse to say he was going to be collecting data. He was asking all kinds of very personal questions. He wanted to take their histories, their sexual histories, right? And he would ask the girls to measure their body parts because he claimed there was no data. Well, that was not true at all. There was plenty of data, plenty of reports out there. They weren't the kind that he wanted, so he made that claim. It was picked up and supported by the Rockefeller Foundation. So in order to understand what people were doing, we have to have a new science. The science would be the science of sexology, which did not exist. There was nothing like that.
Immediately, in the spirit of Sigmund Freud, he railed against the repression of sexual desires. He rejected the unity of science and religion, and thus of nature and nature's God. As a result, he rejected the reality of the two sexes being one flesh, made complementary, and thus the important science of male-female complementarity, that a woman is an XX chromosome karyotype and a man is an XY chromosome karyotype.
If all persons with any trace of homosexual history or those who are predominantly homosexual were eliminated from the population today, there is no reason for believing that the incidence of the homosexual in the next generation would be materially reduced. The homosexual has been a significant part of human sexual activity since the dawn of history, primarily because it is an expression of capacities that are basic in the human animal.
Kinsey's courses became immediately popular among the students. Soon after, Kinsey founded his Institute for Sex Research at Indiana University, with grants from the Rockefeller Foundation and the National Research Council.
Why did the Rockefeller Foundation fund him? Kinsey was a nobody. He comes to them and he says, I'm interested in the same things you're interested in. And so they funded everything through this alleged interest in prostitution and VD.
Dr. Kinsey's team forced subjects to give the desired answers to their sex questions.
His team, good-looking young men, no women, no Jews, no blacks, no Catholics, nobody with any kind of religious, he had a terrible animus against Catholicism.
We are the recorders and reporters of facts, not the judges of the behaviors we describe. The only kinds of sexual dysfunctions are abstinence, celibacy, and delay of marriage.
So where did all these results come from?
They secretly trashed 3/4 of their research data. They based their claims not on a scientific sampling of normal males, but on a roughly 86% aberrant male population. One that included 200 sexual psychopaths, 1,400 sex offenders, and hundreds each of prisoners, male prostitutes, and promiscuous homosexuals.
And he said the prison population represents the public more than the middle-class student would. And women, oh my goodness. He called women who were living with a man for more than a year, the average married woman. A woman who lives with a man for more than a year, suddenly she's a married woman? That was his definition of a married woman. What woman, any woman, but certainly a married woman, would talk to a guy behind closed doors and tell him all about their sex lives, you know? So he made up what he wanted to make up. He made up anything that justified what he wanted to teach the American public was normal, was average, was without consequence, because he said no consequences to multiple partners, no consequences to bestiality, no consequences to any of these things. Do what thou wilt.
Kinsey's fake science and child abuse, how he solicited and encouraged pedophiles, and how they sexually violated from 317 to 2,035 infants and children in order to obtain his alleged data that normalized child sexuality.
Love is the answer, isn't it? But sex raises a lot of very interesting questions. There is a tendency to consider anything in human behavior that is unusual, not well known, or not well understood as neurotic, psychopathic, immature, perverse, or the expression of some sort of psychologic disturbance. Everybody's sin is nobody's sin, and everybody's crime is no crime at all.
Esther White was one of the subjects of Kinsey's fake science. She has suffered profoundly from being tragically molested as a child. The data that came from those horrific crimes committed against Esther was used in Table 34.
I lived in a little bitty town in Ohio. I had a little baby brother and a mother and father. I was a normal kid, except my life was different. It was like living two lives at the same time. It started at Indiana University. My grandfather went there to get his teaching certificates, and Alfred Kinsey was there at the same time, getting everybody in the school involved in his new project. Then my granddad took this teaching with him. So this was spread to the schools he taught at. Then my grandfather taught my father, and my uncle was right along with it. And he got the forms to fill out on all the things that they wanted to know. There was an underworld kind of thing going on that was a very secret world that I was to keep secret from my mother. Don't tell Mommy, you'll cause a divorce. When my father came to me and wanted me to do things that he said were secret, I kept them secret. I didn't understand sexuality even at that time. I knew real love. That's not love. My dad used a stopwatch and he made home movies.
The world is not to be divided into sheep and goats. And not all things are black, nor all things white. The only unnatural act is that which you cannot perform.
Alfred Kinsey wanted to interview me, and so he came to my grandfather's house. This was probably in 1944, and I was born in 34, so that makes me 10 years old at the time. He was a big man, and he had two other big men with him, and one man had a clipboard, and he was taking down answers to my questions, and I was to answer them. I don't remember all the questions now. But one of them is, do you love your daddy? And I answered yes. So before the men were ready to leave, my grandfather says to Alfred Kinsey, oh, what about the check? And he says, oh, I almost forgot. So he gets out this check for, I think, $6,000. In 1947, my dad gave me the pre-published copy of Alfred Kinsey's first book, and he wanted me to give a report to him, a couple of paragraphs on what I thought about the book. Well, when I saw the charts in there, I knew that that was what was going on.
I looked at table 34 in chapter 5. And children as young as 5 months of age in that table were being masturbated, raped. 24 hours around the clock, they were being used. What were they doing to that child? What were they doing? And he says, group number 3, weeping hysterically, especially among the younger children. Children fighting the partner. Partner? This is a man who is raping the child. Fighting the partner to get away. To get away. That is what he called an orgasm.
My dad told me that he had worked with the author, and that the result of that, Alfred Kinsey would change the way the world recognized sexuality.
This was a strategy to normalize sexual deviance, to normalize his own sexual deviance and the sexual deviance of his comrades. Absolutely, this was a strategy, and it has been used since then to today. To today. The claim that children are sexual from birth.
Children are not sexual from birth. I can testify to that.
That is the strategy used to justify teaching kindergartners about sex, about sodomy, every kind of sodomy, calling it just another form of sex, to teach them about the gay, lesbian, and bisexual and transgender and undecided groups. And we don't want them to feel bad because we know that they are children. Since they're children, we know that they are sexual also from birth. So we've got to teach all of our children how to do all of these sexual things and reshape every little brain we possibly can.
No one ever thought about the fact that people would molest children and call it science. I'm sure many of those children, hundreds of children, probably committed suicide. That's profound. But looking back in time, that what I was put through was evil. The worst evil. I am so blessed to even be here. I have to forgive my dad because he was deceived by Kinsey.
Kinsey does Sexual Behavior in the Human Male. It gets a massive communications blitz across the nation. Everybody is hearing about it. Kinsey's telling us the truth about ourselves.
All of this was done with the complicit support of America's mainline media. Life, Look, and Time magazines promoted Kinsey's bold sex findings as heroic scientific truth.
Hugh Hefner, like most guys at that time, were virgins. They were saving themselves for their love, for their beloved, for when they were married, and he believed that. And when he was in college, he read Kinsey's book, Sexual Behavior in the Human Male. And he said, if Kinsey was the scientist, I will be his pamphleteer. And he was. He became his pamphleteer.
The American Statistical Association, in rejecting Kinsey's science, stated, critics are justified in their objections that many of the most interesting and provocative statements in the book are not based on the data presented therein, and it is not made clear to the reader on what evidence the statements are based. Further, the conclusions drawn from the data presented in the book are often stated in much too bold and confident a manner. Taken together, these objections amount to saying that much of the writing in the book falls below the level of good scientific writing. The noted statistician John Tukey condemned the sampling procedure, stating that a random selection of 3 people would have been better than the group of 300 chosen by Mr. Kinsey.
The head of the American Statistical Association sent a bunch of guys, Turkey and 3 guys, to the Kinsey Institute to talk to them about their data. First of all, Kinsey lied, and he said he had a statistician. He never had a statistician.
Kinsey published Sexual Behavior in the Human Female in 1953. Though it didn't sell as well as his first book, it still became a bestseller.
Before Kinsey, you had 3 possibilities of law. One was natural law, biblical law, law by our experience, and then common law. And suddenly that would be replaced by scientific data, science law. What has been proven by science becomes our determination for what will be acceptable in a courtroom.
The Kinsey Institute's fake science and the American Law Institute's model penal code were both funded and quietly implemented by the Rockefeller Foundation, and would be funded further and quietly implemented throughout the world by another Rockefeller-funded project, the United Nations.
The causal effect of Kinsey's fraudulent criminal data. In 1955, the American Law Institute Model Penal Code is produced. It goes throughout the country. It's sent to every state, to all the legislators. And what that would do would eliminate what we had known to be as common law. As a result, it would eliminate much sex offense laws and allow for the parole of sex criminals. And you just give them a little therapy and give them another chance. So fornication and cohabitation would be the first laws that went the way of the dodo bird. But what it did in the long run, eventually, was to weaken or eliminate all of our laws on adultery. Seduction went out the window. Prostitution, solicitation, tremendously weakened. Sodomy and bestiality, normal, harmless, weakened. Obscenity, exhibitionism, alienation of affection, breach of promise, those start to fall. Abortion, and from there, partial birth abortion. Euthanasia, cloning, fetal harvesting, all these things would suddenly require you to go into the court and say, I was physically harmed. There was real damage.
Just when you think you've gotten to their goalpost, you say, okay, so now you have marriage between one man and one woman. You good now? 20 years later, they change it again. They move it. So wait a second, I thought you supported the Defense of Marriage Act. Now the goalpost isn't there, it's here? Well, that's right, we've evolved, we've changed. So they're always moving it all the time. They're constantly changing. And it's maddening, that's very frustrating. What is the end game?
So Playboy funded SECUS, Sex Education Council of the United States, and Mary Calderon, who ran SECUS, who had been the medical educator for Planned Parenthood. So SECUS was formed at the Kinsey Institute with the idea that they would be in charge of sex education and teach in the schools. That formed the foundation for sexology, for the training of sexologists, for the training of sex therapists. How can you be teaching that based on the lies created by a sexual psychopath, a pederast, and identify that as a field of legitimate research, of legitimate influence? And they influence everything.
During the last 6 months of Kinsey's life, his health steadily declined as he gradually developed congestive heart failure. Then one day, walking in his garden, he tripped and fell, injuring his leg. The bruise developed into a deadly embolism. On August 25, 1956, Kinsey died at the hospital in Bloomington, Indiana. He was 62 years old. The Kinsey Institute steadfastly refuses to reveal Kinsey's sources and study methods. This in and of itself renders his scientific research utterly meaningless because it cannot be checked by examination and replication. Because the primary principle of scientific research is that it is useless without verification or replication.
All of this moves to loosen our protective mechanisms for the mother and the child and for the family. And therefore, destroying protection for the mother, the child, the family, destroys the civilization.
The mind is a very, very tricky and delicate thing and not to be messed with. So mind got messed with. And like many people who identify as a transgender person, I never had homosexual desires. I never had, quote, same-sex attraction. You know, it was just an issue of identity. It was an issue of affirmation. I ended up having a girlfriend in high school. I eventually became married, had 2 children. I worked on the Apollo space missions as an associate design engineer. I eventually became an automobile executive for American Honda Motor Company. But I still had this difficulty deep within me that I had not dealt with. So these are the things that I look back on 73 years later from the days of the purple dress. There's a word that was missing from the 4-year-old and from my grandma at that time, is a word called consequences. My grandmother was a seamstress, and she had a little business, cottage business, I'd say, running out of her house where she made women's clothes. My dad and mom would drop me off on the weekend quite frequently, and they would go fishing and camping. And so I was always curious about Grandma making all these clothes, and so there was not much for me to do. Her house was behind a junkyard of old cars, and so there wasn't any much play area. So I just stayed in the house and kind of watched her and became very curious about the clothes. And the more curiosity I had, the more she became interested in my curiosity. And so Grandma decided to make me a purple chiffon evening dress at the age of 4 out of curiosity. And so she affirmed me and encouraged me and loved on me, and that became a symbol in my head about my identity. She wasn't giving me the same affirmation as a little boy that liked to wear cowboy boots, that had ripped blue jeans, that was frequently dirty, and my t-shirts were rather torn and sloppy. And I kind of liked being that way, but in that purple dress, I was quite perfect, quite clean, and that's the way Grandma liked me. So there was a tremendous contrast between the boy and the girl. Well, that became, as Grandma put it, our little secret. And so after about 2.5 years, I took the dress home, and thinking that my parents wouldn't find it, well, my mother found it. And so we had a private little meeting around the dinner table one night with my brother gone, and she asked me where the dress came from, and I told her that Grandma made it. Well, she knew that it was her mother, and so that started this world war within the house between my dad and my mom. And my dad, who was a part-time police officer and industrial goods salesman, was less than thrilled. I mean, he was livid. And so Dad decided he was going to use heavy discipline, which was a hardwood floor plank across my bare butt, to discipline me, to sort of shape me and mold me into a strong guy. It probably did more to break me down than anything. It was demoralizing, it was painful. Even though the dress, I never saw it again, it couldn't go out of my mind. It was planted, it was embedded, it was there. I would go around and steal women's clothes and go hide them in the garage so my parents wouldn't see them, as a way to try to get back to feeling that affirmation that Grandma gave me. I longed for that. Dad's adopted teenage brother, Fred, a troubled young kid. Well, when Fred learned that I had worn a purple dress, Fred decided that he was going to tease and taunt me and make fun of me about wearing a dress. It was pretty normal for a teenage kid to make fun of an 8 or 9-year-old. But it escalated, and it escalated to where he molested me. By the time I was a young teen, I'd taken on a name, Crystal, as a way to self-identify as that person in the purple dress, because it was like a radio playing in my head every day of my life, that if I was going to be affirmed and loved on, I had to be wearing that purple dress, or I had to be a girl. And I became convinced over a period of time that maybe I should have been a girl. I would have been better off. Uncle Fred wouldn't have molested me. Maybe Dad wouldn't have hit me with a hardwood floor plank, and I wouldn't have needed to cross-dress because I would have been all right right out of the gate as a girl.
10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
I, Ronald Reagan, do solemnly swear
that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States
And will, to the best of my ability,
and will, to the best of my ability,
preserve, protect, and defend
preserve, protect, and defend
the Constitution of the United States.
the Constitution of the United States.
So help you God.
So help me God.
Now, this was 1981. I'm nearly 40 years old. So I've been struggling or dealing or thinking or contemplating these things now for 36 years. I went to what they call a gender specialist. And Dr. Walker was the founder, the writer, the expert on gender identity issues. And when I went to him, he diagnosed me with gender identity disorder because they hadn't come up with gender dysphoria yet. So he said, what you need is you need hormone therapy and gender reassignment surgery to resolve the purple dress, the hardwood floor plank, and all the other things that have transpired. And I went back and told my wife what the doctor had said, and we decided to fight it through prayer, but it didn't help. I didn't know exactly what I was dealing with. And so my wife and I decided to get divorced, which we did in late 1982, early 83. And in April of 1983, I underwent gender reassignment surgery at the skilled hands of Dr. Biber, who had, by the time he did my surgery, had already done some 3,000 surgeries. At the end of the surgical procedure, they changed my birth record and my identity to Laura Jensen, female. You would think then, with all of this history, now at the age of 42, this whole purple dress issue would be resolved, that I would be complete, and everybody's talking about this is what you need to do if you're going to be whole and happy, and this was the answer, right? And I decided to study psychology because I wanted to become a counselor and help people deal with these issues. Because I realized I needed more understanding. I needed more help myself. At UC Santa Cruz, and I started opening up those wonderful textbooks that are this thick, and I thought, gee, can I find anything in the pages of these books? And I remember coming across this Cornell University case study. The young individual had lost his mother. His mother had passed away, and he was very close to his mother. And what they decided was the young boy took on his mother's identity as a way to feel close to her. So if he became the female, then he felt like his mother wasn't gone. And I thought, that is not only interesting, it's rather bizarre that our mind could actually, drive us to a different identity as a way to feel close to somebody who really wasn't there, because it's not reality, is it? There's no reality in taking on the identity of somebody who's gone. And so you begin to realize that the people who deal with these cross-gender identity issues are struggling with an inability to deal with reality. And so we take on an identity that isn't real. We make up this identity, Laura Jensen. It was not who I was, although It said on my birth record that I was a female, Laura Jensen. The state had made that possible. The surgeons had done the surgery, to the point of being able to change your gender marker on your birth record started at 4 years old with a simple purple dress. And so I began to look deeper into these issues of psychology and realized there's all kinds of things that people deal with: the body dysmorphic disorder, dissociative disorders, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, and no one's talking about it. They're all looking at people and saying, well, just affirm them and help them change genders. Well, wait a minute. What about the comorbid disorders that are driving them to become someone else to resolve this conflict that lies deep within them? We're doing superficial changes to someone to try to resolve things that are so deep, so painful, so hurtful. But there's one thing that is absolutely crystal clear, and that is the consequences. If in fact we can change and destroy gender identity, if in fact that can be accomplished, then we have destroyed the foundation of the biblical family, one man, one woman. And that, I believe, is ultimately what many of the people who are promoting this ideology really want to do, is to destroy the foundation of Jesus Christ marriage and family.
If anyone today thinks that the imposition of this LGBT transgender ideology is any less a profound distortion of what it means to be a human being than were the Nuremberg laws in 1935, they're kidding themselves. They're kidding themselves.
Father Philip Bachansky is Executive Director of Courage and Encourage International, a Catholic apostolate that offers support for those who experience same-sex attractions and their loved ones.
In the late 1970s, Cardinal Terence Cook was Archbishop of New York and created a new office in his archdiocesan administration, trying to address the needs of the peripheries of the church. One of the things that Cardinal Cook wanted to take particular interest in was the community of Catholics who were experiencing same-sex attractions, living in homosexual relationships or engaged in homosexual intimate acts, and who were coming to Cardinal Cook. He was meeting them in the confessional or in his office and saying, you know, we've been living this way, but we feel a call to do something different, to embrace what the church has to teach about chastity. But we're not sure we can do it on our own. We need help. We need the support of the church. Father Benedict Groeschel, who was assisting the Archdiocese in many ways even back then, and Father Groeschel knew an oblate priest of St. Francis de Sales called Father John Harvey. Father Harvey had studied and written for several years about moral theology, and particularly about human sexuality and the question of homosexuality, that had been giving retreats for priests who were experiencing same-sex attraction and striving to live chastely according to their promise of celibacy. So our first meeting of what would become the Courage Apostolate happened on September 26, 1980. So from that first small meeting in New York, we now have nearly 200 chapters in 15 countries. And I don't know if that first group could have envisioned where we stand today, but certainly we feel that we've inherited a great legacy from them. What every human being is called to do is to pursue the virtue of chastity. Chastity is not repression. It doesn't mean pretending that we don't have desires. Chastity is integration. It means I consider my desires in light of my identity as a child of God, in light of my vocation, and I only act on those desires that are going to get me closer to being a saint, to living as a disciple, to living a holy life.
Father Paul Sullins is Research Professor of Sociology at Catholic University of America and Senior Research Associate of the Ruth Institute. Formerly Episcopalian, Father Sullins is a married Catholic priest with 3 children.
The brain differences between a man and a woman go all the way down. It's not just that gender is somehow a social expression. The social scientists are, while they're pursuing that agenda, the hard scientists are showing us that you can take the brains of 2 persons. You can't tell whether they're black or white. You can't tell what language they speak. You can't tell a lot of social things about them. But one thing you can tell is whether it's a man or a woman, a male brain or a female brain. And those differences are profound and persistent through all of our being, all of our life.
Kinsey's work of mainstreaming homosexuality and sexual perversion has damaged the Catholic priesthood and catapulted the Church into the worst abuse crisis in its history. It has already been shown that Bella Dodd, the former American communist, confessed to her friends, Drs. Dietrich and Alice von Hildebrand, of her success in recruiting over 1,100 men to the priesthood in the 1930s. But in an exclusive interview, Alice clarified that Bella told her that these men were not just communists, but homosexuals.
The communists are very clever, and he knew perfectly well that in order to destroy Catholicism, what they destroyed was to pervert priests. And so she says that there were seminaries, I think that in Poland, who were trained to spread homosexuality among priests. And she collaborated. She was truly very, very active, precisely. And she told me about this here. And she succeeded.
The case of Mr. Theodore McCarrick demands a thorough report as to how such a man with his sexual abuse history could have risen to such positions of power in the Church. The U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops has commissioned 2 reports by the John Jay College of Criminal Justice. Those reports found that over 80% of the victims were neither girls nor prepubescent children, which is true pedophilia. They were preteen and teenage boys. These results clearly indicate that the problem was male-on-male homosexuality by priests against underage boys. The Church has a problem with male-on-male predation by priests. To set the problem in the context of society, in 2002, the Federal Department of Education completed a study of sexual abuse in America's public schools, based on its No Child Left Behind project. The study was led by Carol Shakeshaft. Interviewed after completing the study, she was asked to comment on her results in the light of the Catholic Church priest abuse problem. She said, "Yes, the Catholic Church has a problem, but the physical sex abuse of students in schools is likely more than 100 times the abuse level in the Church." In 1983, in light of the developing priest sex abuse crisis, the St. Luke Institute was founded by Father Michael Peterson, an open homosexual and psychiatrist who began treating homosexual priest abusers. In 1985, a year before dying of AIDS, Peterson developed a plan for the bishops, which recruited two Kinseyite doctors, John Money and Fred Berlin, who, in the words of Peterson, can bring this psychiatric disorder out of the shadows and into the scientific daylight, and see this disorder as a psychiatric disease and not a moral weakness. On March 21, 1993, the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette obtained a copy of a secret Vatican signatura which stated, St. Luke's Institute, a clinic founded by a priest who is openly homosexual and based on a mixed doctrine of Freudian pansexualism and behaviorism, is surely not a suitable institution.
At an apartment in Greenwich Village, and they would all sit around this big, long, oval table, and every single meeting was opened with this same mantra. And the chairwoman would ask, why are we here today? To make revolution, they answered. What kind of revolution, she replied. The cultural revolution, they chanted. And how do we make cultural revolution, she demanded. By destroying the American family, they resounded. How do we destroy the family, she came back. By destroying the American patriarch, they cried exuberantly. And how do we destroy the American patriarch, she replied. By taking away his power. How do we do that? By destroying monogamy, they shouted. And how do we destroy monogamy? By promoting promiscuity, eroticism, prostitution, abortion, and homosexuality, they resounded.
Being Jewish and hearing, the whole World War II Holocaust thing, the Nuremberg trials, said that the people that do stuff are responsible for what they do.
Brian Kamiker is director of Mass Resistance, a leading pro-family activist organization founded in 1995 to provide information and guidance to people who confront the assaults on traditional family, school children, and the moral foundations of society.
As Pope John Paul said, we have to fearlessly tell the truth. And so what Mass Resistance does is sort of revolutionary within this movement. It's actually taking it seriously as a culture war. And understanding that it's a house of cards, but it's not going to go away by itself. It's going to take, a push. And it can either happen now or it can happen in 80 years, like the Soviet Union. It's up to us, but it is not permanent. It is unnatural, and it is destroying all of us.
Vladimir Lenin said, the best revolutionary is a youth denied of morals. Whereas John Adams says, the Constitution was created for a moral and religious people. It cannot govern any other.
They understand what earlier radical movements, such as the communist movement, understood, which is that you got to take down God. You've got to take God out of this. You have to take religion out of this, because religion gets in your way.
The eminent philosopher Eric Voegelin said, historically, the murder of God is not followed by the Superman, but by the murder of man. The deicide of the Gnostic theoreticians is followed by the homicide of the revolutionary practitioners. With the Chinese virus COVID-19, we've slipped into a dystopian world of social engineering. This was described by Fabian socialist Aldous Huxley as the Brave New World. Huxley's friend Aleister Crowley was also a mutual friend of Alfred Kinsey. Aldous Huxley did social engineering research at the Tavistock Institute. In the 1950s, he and Alfred Kinsey worked for the CIA's MK-Ultra program. Their research focused on drug and sex-induced mind control.
Namely, there is a dominant minority that makes a lot of noise and that uses violence to force its will upon others. Second, political mysticism is, of course, there is no God. It's my will or nothing. This is what the elite insists upon. No alternative, no compromise. In this mysticism, a tabula rasa, they would wipe the slate clean of anything that opposed them. And then after they'd destroyed life and property, they would ask for an amnesty and immunity. Thirdly, Satanism is the third characteristic of it. The world is built on order. There's a plan, so scientists are able to discover the laws of the universe. And in discovering the laws of the universe, men find harmony. This harmony and order had to come from somewhere. It came from God. What is the essence of Satanism? The essence of Satanism is the destruction of that order. The order of law, the order of morality, the order of religion, the order of ethics, anything that you please.
The point of the spear of the gender agenda is the radical feminist movement, today's wolves in sheep's clothing, whom we know by their fruits.
The last age is like a gray wolf, neither black nor white, but gray.
Let me raise the cry of alarm. The house of God is on fire. Souls are perishing in the flames. The sanctuary itself is ablaze. Help. Help, good people. Help our brother who is being murdered, our children being massacred, our kind father being done to death. They have sounded the alarm, vented their anger, and become a mighty army. Let us break their bonds asunder and throw away their yoke.
In 1981, Father Carlo Cafara received a letter from Sister Lucia, the lone surviving visionary of Fatima.
Father, a time will come when the decisive battle between the kingdom of Christ and Satan will be over marriage and the family. And those who will work for the good of the family will experience persecution and tribulation. But do not be afraid, because Our Lady has already crushed his head.
Almighty God and His Holy Mother will raise up saints who will surpass in holiness most other saints. Chosen to oppose the enemies of God, they will be exceptionally devoted to the Blessed Virgin, illumined by her light, strengthened by her Spirit, supported by her arms, sheltered under her.
the church teaches us that sexual intimacy has a twofold purpose, that it builds up a married couple in that union, that communion of persons that we see as God's original plan for sexuality. It's based on that the one flesh union, which is made possible by their complementarity. And it also is the way that God calls his children to cooperate with him in giving the gift of new life. And so properly ordered sexual intimacy has both of those aspects to it. The unitive, the one flesh union between a man and a woman, and the openness to procreation in the way that the intimate act is carried out.
So you can see this within Catholic theology, especially reflections on the Trinity, that there's both unity and multiplicity. And so God is both one and three. Insofar as God's love is overflowing, so it's generative, both inside the Godhead itself, but then also into creation. Right? So God's love overflows, so it communicates itself to creation and then shares in that life. So too, the love between spouses, unity and multiplicity. They're two people, they unite as one flesh in an act that is generous. Right? And so you can say generations, generosity, generative act. They all have the same root, genus, or gen. And then you can see from there that love overflows to the creation of new life. Multiplicity and unity, fruitfulness, generosity. And which is why it's not surprising that you see gender has that same root.
I think this is such a valuable time. My prayer for this time is that it will change things, that it will begin to add to the other people a million of brilliant people who are coming out and talking like I am. Let's keep this going. Let's have this be the start of the end of the LGBT movement, and let's make it today.
It was Cicero who said that true law is right reason in agreement with nature. And it is a sin to try to abolish this law. He was talking about natural law. Take Cicero and Aristotle, Roman and Greek, both before Christ. And both of them had this inherent understanding that there is a natural order to things. And that's something, too, that the church understands, right? The idea of faith and reason, fides et ratio. Faith and reason reinforce one another. And so do faith and freedom. Ronald Reagan talked about faith and freedom being the twin beacons that brighten the American sky. And if you take away one of those beacons, well, the sky is less light, it's darker, and it's harder to navigate yourself around. Faith helps navigate freedom. Faith is like the rudder for freedom. If you just have freedom without faith, it can be rudderless, and that's what leads to licentiousness.
Maybe God is stirring us, bringing us to the brink of danger, in order that we might begin to examine ourselves and restore Jefferson, the dignity of man, and a belief in God. Our nation is too full of those that are crying down. Down with the universities, down with schools, down with the churches, down with teachers, down with government, down with the police. Can you build anything down? You cannot. Certainly time in our nation to change our words. And let's begin now to use the word up. Up from all of this filth. Up from this violence. Up from this indifference of courts. Up, up to the hid battlements of eternity. Up, up to God.
is in its best balance. What's usually going on is that men are running the world and women are running society. They run the home. And in our America, when women were doing this at the height of women running society, almost everybody was going to church or synagogue during those times. And they ran their home according to the Ten Commandments, so that the children learned that from infancy. And then from there, this Ten Commandment behavior would go out into all of industry, all of the institutions, the schools, everywhere, because it was all formed in the home, so that we had healthy communities and healthy society.
The Trinity itself being a family. And look at the original Holy Family. It's Joseph, Mary, and Jesus. There you have a father and a mother and a child. So I think in many ways, the faith is speaking to us and telling us that there's an inherent model there, both supernatural and natural as well, supported by natural law and biblical law, which calls for a mother and a father and for children to be raised as part of the family.
I would pray to God that we could have some sort of mass conversion here in the country where women will realize that they have the most powerful position. As Father George Rutler says, the most powerful person on earth is a mother.